Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 162 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Please send your questions to ask@nonmonogamyhelp.com and they'll either be read in the podcast or in the column anonymously. You can let me know which one you prefer. You can get everything at nonmonogamyhelp.com. Sign up to the early emails that I send out on Wednesdays by going to nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. And you can follow on Instagram at nonmonogamyhelp and TikTok at nonmonohelp. And if you join the podcast shout-out tier, if you go to nonmonogamyhelp.com/subscribe, then I will, with your permission, read your name at the end of the podcast. Let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first time you're hearing this, every week before I read the letter, I put forth a discussion question that you can use with your friends, partners, or anyone else to get to know them a little bit more. I also answer it myself briefly to give you a little bit of context. This week's discussion question is an Otter Being Polyamory Conversation card discussion question. These are pretty cool. They're a bunch of little cards, as you can tell. It's what it says on the tin. It's not super complicated. And they let you ask questions that similar to discussion questions I had in the past. And you can get them at nonmonogamyhelp.com/cards and get 10% off using non-monohelp at checkout. I will go ahead and draw a card. I didn't plan this very well. That's fine. All right. This week's card is, how can your partner or partners best support you when you're facing challenges in your other relationships or have a broken heart? Interesting. I think that, I try really hard to keep things parallel because I don't really want other people to feel like, I feel like whenever you have friends and you're like going through relationship difficulties, it makes sense to lean on your friends because that's the point of friendship. But I think it kind of becomes awkward when it's another partner because they're not necessarily a completely objective third party. I have been in positions where I've given advice to partners about other relationships they've been in, and I don't mind doing that, but I think it can get super awkward. It can become an issue of privacy as well, like knowing a little bit too much about what's going on in your partner's other relationship, and that might be putting you in a weird position. So I try really hard not to put my partners in that type of position where they might know too much. But I would just ask for general, any other time that I'm facing challenges in life in general, just ask for their support. And, they can distract me, they can make me feel better, all kinds of stuff like that. So that's kind of generally how I would ask for support. But I would try really hard to avoid using them as an advisory. Not that that's always bad. Like I said, I've done it before, but I try to avoid that just because I don't want them to feel awkward in a situation. But yeah, the discussion question is, how can your partner or partners best support you when you're facing challenges in your relationships or have a broken heart? Let's get to this week's question. Before we get to this week's question, I would like to introduce you all to an event that's going to be happening in September. I know that it can be really, really difficult to feel your feelings, especially in your body sometimes. And I know that I'm one of those people that has really disassociated whenever I'm going through a lot. And sometimes your brain understands the logic of non-monogamy, but your body is kind of going through its own thing and your emotions are going through its own thing. So connecting those two pieces can be really, really difficult. Dedeker Winston of the Polyamory podcast and dance movement therapist Orit Krug are hosting a somatic therapy retreat for polyam folks in northern Spain from September 22nd to the 25th in 2025 this year. You can learn about body-based approaches for navigating relationship conflict, find new ways to move through intense emotions like jealousy or new relationship energy. You can connect with others who understand the unique challenges of polyam relationships, and you can do it in a beautiful, natural setting with accommodations and meals and snacks and everything included with a private chef. You can come solo, With a partner or with multiple partners, there is sliding scale pricing, and they try to keep the retreats small in size. And I know I've talked about a previous retreat as well that Dedeker has put on, and this one's in Spain, so that's super exciting. So yeah, if you're interested, you can visit multiamory.com/retreat to learn more and apply. That's multiamory.com/retreat. I'm struggling with a non-monogamous relationship where I experience persistent discomfort about my partner's limited availability of time and affection. While he has been with his primary partner for 10 years, they recently transitioned to non-monogamy last year. They live together, travel together, and share significant life experiences. With me, available time always feels like an afterthought, mere 30-minute slots in an entire week. This imbalance has caused me to cry after our meetings, feel anxious about when I'll see him next, and recently, when I was aware he was traveling with his other partner, I felt an overwhelming sense of injustice and inequality in our relationship. I left that encounter completely distressed. The constant state of having unresolved issues while maintaining daily communication is causing me persistent anxiety. What makes this particularly difficult is that I is an incredible person with strong emotional intelligence, and we connect beautifully as friends and lovers. Our compatibility on an intellectual and friendship level is undeniable, which makes the relationship challenges even more frustrating. I'm increasingly aware that I might be asking someone for something they simply cannot give me. Perhaps maintaining this relationship that continuously crosses my emotional boundaries isn't worth the toll it's taking. While I don't want to cut ties with him completely, I feel we're approaching an unsustainable situation. My therapist has helped me recognize that my primary commitment must be to myself and my well-being. While I care for him deeply and value the connection we've built, I'm questioning if this relationship structure works for me. I don't see a positive resolution ahead without significant changes in how time, attention, and commitment are distributed. I already take a space from daily communication until we can have a proper conversation about these fundamental issues, as protecting my emotional health has become my priority. Can you give me some advice? I confess I'm a little lost about how I can manage it. Before we get to this week's answer, I want to quickly remind you of this episode's sponsor, BetterHelp. Quite often in a lot of my columns and podcasts, I encourage people to seek a polyamory-friendly therapist, and for a lot of people looking locally for a therapist who may be supportive or understanding of polyamory can be impossible or out of their budget. BetterHelp allows you to find therapists online that you can send messages to at any time of the day, and they do offer some financial aid. You can get 10% off your first month by using the promo code non-monogamyhelp at checkout or going to betterhelp.com/non-monogamyhelp. Let's get to this week's answer. So the thing that I want to point out, and I want you to think about going forward, because this is something that I see a lot of people doing, and it's not a judgment or anything like that, but I see people talking about things that are crossing their emotional boundaries or things that are crossing boundaries. And I see people saying things like, what do I do if someone crosses my boundary? And I really feel like that question should never really have to be asked. Like, you should never have to ask, what do I do if someone crosses my boundary? Because the boundary in and of itself, by definition, should include what you will do if it is crossed. Because that is the boundary. That is actually what it is. Rules and boundaries get really kind of used within the same, like, as interchangeable words, not just in polyamory, but all around. But they actually are functionally different things. And the reason why I think it's different, to emphasize the importance of the difference between a rule and a boundary, is because a rule, and I've said this before, but it bears repeating, a rule is a sort of dictate in a way, or it's about what somebody else is doing, right? A rule is, if the example that I constantly give is like, if you don't want to be around drunk people, you don't like when your partner drinks, or you feel like your partner is drinking too much or whatever, and you say you're not allowed to drink, you can't drink anymore, or you can't drink too much, or you can't come home drunk. That is a rule. A boundary is, okay, I don't like when somebody is drunk around me. I don't think it's good for our relationship. So my boundary is that if you come home drunk, I am not going to sleep in the same bed with you. I'm going to sleep somewhere else. If you continue to drink and I feel like it's getting too much, this is what I'm going to do in response to that. So when somebody says something like, what do I do? This person's crossing my boundaries and I don't know what to do. When you're making a boundary, you need to think about what you will do if it's crossed, because that's the point. A boundary isn't really about controlling what the other person is doing. A boundary is about what you're going to do, either in order to facilitate the relationship better or in order to create space and protect yourself. So going forward, whenever you think about your boundaries, you need to think about what you're going to do in response. And that's another thing. When it comes to what other people, other grown adults do, you can't control what other grown adults do. What you can do is, I think it's from Matthias Barker that I learned about the 3 C's: consent, confront, or cut. So you can either consent to the situation that's happening, like this is how you're going to get time with this partner. This is the way that their time is going to be allocated. And you can consent to that. And what consenting to that means is that you're not holding on to resentment about it. You're not sitting there and, being emotionally unhappy about the situation that it's affecting your relationship. Consenting means consenting to that. Like it's what Dan Savage calls the price of admission. You accept that this is the situation. And some people can do that. Like, there are little consents that we make all the time in relationships. Maybe we really hate that our partner likes jazz. That's not really a concession, but like you consent to a situation that you're like, okay, I don't really like this, but it's worth the price of admission for staying with this person. And there are ways we do that around, polyamory. We might date somebody who, maybe we don't enjoy having children, but we're not necessarily anti-child, and we date someone who has a child. You may not be super keen about being around children, but you might go, you know what, for the purposes of being in this relationship, if this person has a child and they're actively involved in their child's life, and that may then mean that their child is around us both, then I can consent to that situation. So that's another example. So you can consent to the situation. It doesn't sound like you want to consent to the situation. It sounds like you've been trying to consent to the situation and it's not working. So you're not really consenting to that. It's not worth the price of admission for you. The second thing you can do is confront. So if there are situations that you're unhappy with, you need to confront the situations. You need to ask for them to change. People can't change if they don't know that they need to change, or they don't know that if you just sit there and you never say anything about it, and you never outline this clearly, then they can't actually make that change. And I don't know, is that like you don't talk about whether or not you've actually sat down with your partner and you've said, I'm unhappy with the amount of time that I have with you. I don't feel like the time I have is valued. This isn't necessarily about what's going on with his other partner. It's just difficult not to feel that sense of injustice and equality because you have that direct comparison, right? And so you need to figure out, okay, what do you need from this relationship in order for it to be fulfilling for you? Because as I've said multiple times, polyamory is not about finding multiple semi-sustaining relationships until you reach a level of permissible stasis, right? It's every relationship should be fulfilling in some way. They don't have to be fulfilling in the same way, but they need to be fulfilling in some way. So how much time do you need? What type of time do you need? Do you want to have, for example, like every Thursday night is your night, and that is barring a deep, sudden emergency, that is the time that you have together, and that is your set time? Is that something that would make you feel valued? Then ask for that. And, if they are in a relationship where, they've been together for 10 years, and I do think that it's understandable. Like Dan Savage has talked about this a little bit recently in some of the advice he's given. And I do somewhat agree with the idea that, and I'm very much also like a relationship anarchist, but I do think that like if somebody has been with somebody for 10 years, just as if I were friends with someone who had a friend that they've been friends with since they were a child, I wouldn't necessarily expect our emotional closeness to be exactly identical, right? But I would want to feel equal in the sense of being equally valued, or being given autonomy in the situation. And the problem is that you're not being given autonomy in the situation. They have this relationship with this other person that they live with and that they share a lot of time with, but you don't feel like you have any control or even any input in the sort of time slots you get. You said, it's always an afterthought. It's not an active decision that you feel like you have any control over, and they are truly not taking responsibility. Now, the one thing that I would really encourage you to remember, because this was my opinion and feeling when I was a live-in partner with somebody, time spent in the same physical vicinity is not the same as quality time together. I don't know if they have children, and that will also impact, their situation. But yes, it's time spent together isn't automatically quality time. As much as I totally acknowledge, and I'm not saying you're wrong for feeling like they have all this time together, because they do live together and there obviously are benefits of that, but there are also a lot of drawbacks. And, it's not your responsibility to manage the emotions of his other partner, or even I'm not saying you shouldn't care and that it's just like whatever. But I think it sometimes gets easily lost from my perspective of being the other woman, or not really the other woman, but like from being the live-in partner and being told that my situation is super privileged and we have all this time together. Meanwhile, I felt very much like like we had all of the negative stuff. Like we got to fight about laundry. We got to deal with bills together. It didn't feel like living together was a super positive thing. And we didn't have, and in a lot of relationships that I have where I lived with people, it was actually quite challenging to carve out quality time together. And actually being around each other all the time doesn't necessarily always facilitate the best connection with each other. So it's less to say that you have nothing to complain about, and more just to remind you a little bit that the grass is not always greener. Like that grass is probably not as green as you think it is, but you still should confront the situation immediately if you haven't already. Maybe you have. It doesn't say that you have here, but definitely sit down and think about what it is that you want. How much time do you want? Express that you want this to be his decision and that you want it to be an active decision he's making. You don't want to be an afterthought. You don't want 30-minute slots. You want planned, intentional quality time. And that is a fair thing to ask for. And it's not surprising you feel injustice and inequality. You may not have full equity because your situations are completely different and you don't live together. I don't know what kind of other obligations they may share together, but that doesn't mean that you don't get a say. And that doesn't mean that the time that he chooses to have with you can't be super intentional. So ask for that if you haven't already. That's the confront aspect, because people can't change if they don't know that there is a problem. And sometimes in certain situations, I'm not saying it's necessarily you, I think people get scared to ask for what they want. I know I definitely have in the past. So they don't, and then they try to hint at it or, whatnot. And then they end up frustrated and resentful, and that messes the relationship up. So yes, consent, confront, and then the final bit is cut. So if you have asked for what you want, if you are not getting it after a period of time, and whatever period of time is really personal and up to you, it may be difficult especially if they've just opened and they've been together for 10 years and they haven't really done a lot of research into non-monogamy. What I think a lot of people do when they open as a couple is that they kind of go, okay, we're non-monogamous now, but then they don't think about the time that they spend with each other and the time they want to spend with other people. They are super focused on preventing all of the negative emotions that they might feel, and they kind of continue to behave just exactly the same way they were when they were monogamous without really, and then it becomes difficult for them to actually have to adjust their schedule because they haven't put any thought into that. And I don't think it's necessarily an intentional thing. I just think people don't have models for this kind of stuff. People don't know. Like there's no social models for how this is supposed to happen. So they're just doing what it is they've done before because they really don't know any better. So I want to give them some grace in that this may not be intentional at all. It may just be like they've been together for 10 years. This is how they've done things. And they're going to have to shift the time that they spend. And the difficulty may be for them, and for a lot of people who open their relationship, fundamentally, if you're choosing polyamory and you decide to open your relationship, regardless of what kind of polyamory you want to practice, you are going to choose a situation where you get less time with your partner than you would typically get in a monogamous situation. And they will have to adjust to that less time. They will both have to mourn that. They both have to accept that that is part of the situation. It's not just like monogamy plus. It's not just monogamy with the permission to cheat every once in a while if what they want is actually polyamory. And it might also be good to sit down and have a discussion about what kind of polyamory they want to practice. Have they thought about the time that they want to spend with other people versus themselves? Have they allocated their schedules? Have they thought about how new people fit into their lives? And I don't think that every single couple that hasn't thought about this is trying to hurt anybody. But I think sometimes they get kind of caught up in the freedom aspect of it, or they get caught up in the idea of it, and they don't really think about the practicalities of it. So I would have that discussion. I would outline that, like, look, I really need this time. I need to know what kind of polyamory you're interested in. I need to know how I fit into your life. I need scheduled, intentional, dedicated time. And you can come to an agreement about what that is. You may want 3 days a week. Maybe he can't do 3 days a week. Maybe you get 2 days. Like, you can negotiate about that, and you can see if that works for you. Because this may also be a process of seeing what works for you. What is your ideal polyamory situation? Are you hoping that are you actually looking for an anchor style of a relationship, and this isn't something that this person can offer for you? How do other relationships, if you get into another relationship on top of this, how does that fit in with your life? You need to also come to the table with an understanding of what it is that you want, other than just, this is making me unhappy. It's also difficult. It's going to be difficult for you to know how to negotiate time if you don't know what time you want, or you don't have a faintest idea, or you don't know, all you have is kind of monogamy as a blueprint. And obviously he can't give you as much time as he gives his other partner. He can't just physically, because he's living with that other person. Now, obviously scheduled intentional time, as I said, is different, but there are going to be some discrepancies there unless you decide to move in with him, which I would not recommend. You are going to have some type of inequality in a way. It's just a matter of how can you ask for what it is that you actually want and see if he's able to meet that. See if he's able, and it may be that, like I said, the consent aspect of it is sometimes about negotiation. It may be that ideally you would have 3 or 4 nights a week with him, but, or I don't know if you get online time or how this is divvied up, but basically, like, ideally you might want a lot more time, but you're okay with 2 nights, you're okay with 3 nights, figure that out together and see if it changes. And if he is unable to have that, if he blames his partner for it, if he's like, oh, I want to give you 3 nights a week, but my wife is just too unhappy and I don't think I could, I have personally, I have very little patience for people who can't stand in their own decisions. Understandably, a lot of people in kind of couple relationships where they end up in the situation where they're trying to behoove their anchor partner or the person that they've been with for 10 years, and they don't want to ask for what it is that they want. They don't want to be, they don't want to say no to their partner. So then they just end up blaming their partner. And they can't stand in the decision of their inability to say no and make, because if he wants to behoove his other partner, if he wants to make decisions based on his other partner's emotional reactions, that is still his decision and he needs to own that. So I personally would not put up with anyone trying to offload their emotional decisions or their own personal decisions on the emotions of their partner. So I would be on the lookout for that. But otherwise, yeah, just ask. Come to the table, have a little bit of a sit down moment and think about what you want. Come to the table with an ask, see if he's willing to meet that. And if he's not willing to meet that, then that might be a time for you to choose the cut option and step away and find some other relationship that actually does fulfill you. You don't have to stay with somebody just because there is no reason to break up because it's polyamory. It doesn't mean there isn't a reason to break up. Sometimes when a relationship doesn't fit your needs, you can step away from it and go, you know what, it's not fitting my needs. And even if I'm not married or living with someone, I don't know if that's something that you want, but even if it's not that, you still have needs and those are still valid. So yeah, I hope that helps and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 162. Is that right? That is right. Thank you for listening to episode 162 of Non-Monogamy Help. If you want to be awesome, you can sign up to the website at the podcast support tier. I'm doing a great job of this, nonmonogamyhelp.com/subscribe. And my current podcast shout-out supporters are Ermi, Mike Kandar, and Matios Caden. If for whatever reason you cannot support economically, there are a few things that you can do. There is a free tier that you can subscribe to where you'll get the columns and podcasts in your inbox on Fridays, nonmonogamyhelp.com/subscribe. You can sign up to the early access email by going to nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. If you take a screenshot of the podcast and share it to your stories, that would really, really help. You can also tag the Non-Monogamy Help account, and I would be more than happy to share it. You can also rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. That's all for this week. You will get a new column next Friday and another podcast episode in a fortnight. Thank you again for listening. Also, I am going to have a new book coming out called Supporting Someone Polyamorous. So if you are struggling to explain polyamory to family members, if you're very exhausted by it, if you are getting weird but typical questions that you're just like, oh, I really don't want to answer this, then please check out my book, Supporting Someone Polyamorous. It's designed to be something that you can give to family members, friends, anyone who asks these questions that are really annoying, but it's not their fault because they don't know. You can just give them the book, and hopefully that will help them feel like they understand you a little bit more and help them support you a little bit more. So yeah, it's called Supporting Someone Polyamorous, and you can get it at Jessica Kingsley Publishers. Thank y'all. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. The music was done by Chris Albury Jones at albury-jones.com. Thank you for listening.